If you're an animator and you're going to be working with characters, environments, vehicles, sometimes you actually need the other characters or background elements and environments to be present while you're actually setting up the scene and keying poses and setting up interactions. So when you do that, it actually increases the amount of weight that the amount of calculations that your processor has to handle. And of course, you can always stick things on layers and just hide them so that basically it cuts down on the weight, or you're showing low res versions of the models, things like that. But sometimes doing that makes it that much more difficult to set up specific poses and specific interactions. One thing that you could do to lighten the computer's load is, instead of having it basically play back the animations of everything together, is you can simply select the geometry of the character or the part of the animated environment that has to move as well, and you can actually create a cache for it. It's called a geometry cache. And so your geometry cache is usually going to be available under animation menus. If you go to the geometry cache menu, with your geometry selected, whether it's NURBS, polygons, or a combination of the two, just select the geometry and just tell it to create a new cache. Now, there's one important thing to remember before you do that. When you're creating a cache of any kind, it's usually only going to work for the geometry which has been skinned or bound to a joint structure, because it's actually controlling the components. So it won't work for anything that's parented or constrained to the joint structure. So when I select one geometry and I tell it to create a new cache, I'll go to the option box so we can see the options. And so we can see that it's going to use the default cache directory within my project. And right now it's showing the name of one of the multiple objects I've selected. I actually have multiple objects within the character's mesh. It's just showing the last one selected, or it's actually showing the name of the shape, because when you're creating the cache, like I said, it's going to affect the components of the geometry, which basically are part of the shape, not the top level transform. Okay, so not the keyable elements of the object. And so then you can choose the cache format. You have two different formats. I believe one's compressed and one's not. I'm going to use the MCX, which I believe is the one that's uncompressed. And you can usually choose to create a cache that's going to create individual files for basically every piece of geometry, or you can have it create one entire file for the entire cache, which can be sometimes a little easier to keep track of. But if you do need to make updates to the cache, you'd have to update the entire cache file instead of just a section of it. Okay, and so then we have the cache time range, and that's pretty apparent. You can do specific sections of the timeline, or the entire time slider, or whatever. You can do it based on render settings. So very useful. And of course you can specify whether it's going to do cache every frame or every other frame or whatever. And so you can just tell it to create the cache. And I already have one there from the last time I tried this out. I'm just going to tell it to replace the existing. It'll save it. It'll basically play through the timeline to write the cache for that character. Now remember, it's only the character that's selected. And so once it's finished, okay, it's all done. And if you actually look in your channels box, we actually have under inputs, we have a little history. Okay, so now we have some cache history from the creation of that cache. And that cache actually has various options on it that you can use to control the playback. So by default, it's basically just reflecting our timeline and certain other defaults. If I actually rewind and press play, you can see that it just plays through. Let's take a look and see what we can do with our cache. So I'm going to select all of this geometry again, go back to the cache. And so as you can see, it starts on frame 1. Now if I told it to offset by, let's say, 10, so I had to start on frame 11 instead, you could see right away that the geometry that's actually bound to the joint structure, it's basically 10 frames ahead of what's parented to the skeletal structure. And that's because everything parented to the skeletal structure or constrained to it doesn't actually have a cache assigned to it because it wasn't bound, so it couldn't have a cache assigned to it. So when I play back, it will play through the entire animation. But as you can see, the skeletal structure is lagging behind it because the skeletal structure is not cached and nothing attached to it is. It's just the animation on the geometry. So it's almost like baking the animation into the geometry, except that it is temporary because we can just go in and we can just turn it off. And as you can see, the geometry just snaps back. So now it's just following the joint structure again. And it could go in and make changes to the animation, no problem. Okay. Now another thing you can do using the history from your cache, and put it back to frame 1 so it's synchronized, you can actually change the playback speed. And instead of being speed for the geometry cache, it's actually called scale. Now the great thing about scale is it'll allow you to speed up, slow down, basically change the timing of your animation, and all of these attributes you could make them connect them to a top level attribute on some sort of control, so you can make all of these things keyable. You could even right click on them, I believe, and just make them keyable. If we want to make this a little slower, I'm going to make it, let's say, 1.1 on the playback, on the scale. And then we'll play it back. And as you can see, the geometry lags behind the skeletal structure just a little bit relative to the scale. If I make it 2, it basically plays it back at half speed, so it's really far behind our joint structure, as you can see. It's playing back at half speed, basically slow-mo, which could actually be very useful under certain circumstances. Okay, so you can actually have a lot of fun with your geocache, whether speeding up, slowing down, or anything else. Now, another thing you can do is you can also offset the playback. So by default, it starts playing the resource at frame 1. We can just tell it to start the animation altogether at a completely different frame. So I'll set it for 50 instead of 1, in which case it should hold. Now, if you're saying that it didn't hold, it actually did. What it actually did there is it basically played back the regular animation, and then once it hit frame 50, it played the cache. So it held off playing the cache until frame 50. Okay? So basically what you could do with that is you could have your cache animation, and let's say you needed to make some modifications in the leading up to that point with the animation. You could basically have your animation start at frame 50 for the cache and basically just have it transition over. Okay, so that way you lead in from live animation into the cache. And just to make it a little clearer about what's happening, I'll tell it to start the playback for the cache at 40 so that you can actually see the little jump between the two. So it's playing live, and then at 40 it switches, as you can see, and see now it's following the live animation. Okay? So of course you also have the option to do a couple different things other than playback start and speed. You can also specify the direction of the animation, meaning that you can specify whether it's playing it in reverse or forward, and sometimes that can come in handy. So if I activate reverse, and I'll rewind the timeline, as you can see it starts at the end of the animation, the geometry does, but the skeletal structure is obviously starting at the beginning, and so it basically has them dancing in reverse. Okay, so finally we have a couple of different options that usually need to work together. So we have the pre-cycle and post-cycle, and we have oscillate. So post-cycle is pretty straightforward. Just like if you're on the graph editor and you want to cycle a walk cycle or any sort of action or any sort of animation, you can tell it to cycle it post or pre. So in this case, you can cycle it post infinity, pre infinity, whatever. So you can have it cycle it before or after the existing range of frames. So in the case of the cache, you're going to do the same thing. I'm going to tell it to cycle it once. Okay, so my animation ends at around 260. So if I scrub past 260, you can see that it starts the cycle again. Simple. Okay, now if I come in and I turn on oscillate at the same time, and then scrub past 260, it basically starts playing the animation in reverse at that point. So once it gets to the end, it basically rewinds and plays it again. And once it got to the end of that cycle, it would stop because it's only told to cycle it once beyond that point. Okay? So very cool options to have. You can play around with this and do some really cool stuff depending on what you need to do. Now, like anything that deals with caching, you can of course go to your geometry cache menu and you can attach different caches to the geometry. Usually as long as the cache has come from the character in other scene files or other actions, then you can attach different caches to basically apply different animations. So this is a nice way to build up a nice little archive of actions for your character. You could save yourself a little time in different scenes.